you for coming. I'm going to do a short reading, and it's very exciting because I'm psyched to be in conversation with Chanel, and also I'm psyched to read for my first official public book tour event for Seeing Ghosts. It's really cool, and I really appreciate everyone signing on. So the section that I'm going to read is a very kind of brief vignette from when I was in college and recalling a memory of my mom that was sort of triggered by the idea of her name. Hold on, my earpiece is coming out. Okay. It was the summer between sophomore and junior year of college, and for the past couple of months, I had fallen into a routine with my friend Lexi. I headed to my internship in the suburbs, where I worked for the third summer in a row with the cable company's communications department as part of a scholarship program. Lexi huddled at her desk in the school paper's newsroom, where she was an editor. After work, we sat in a coffee shop and tapped out freelance assignments. From there, we hung in my apartment watching Hallmark movies or old rom-coms into the early morning hours, passing between us a jug of Carlo Rossi that we'd bought months earlier to make sangria and had since become acrid. Most nights, before the movie ended, I crawled to the air mattress that I'd slept on for the past year and fell asleep. Lexi dozed on my couch, rousing in the early morning to walk the half block to her place. But that night, after Lexi left, I woke and was unable to fall back asleep. Still woozy and flushed from wine, I thumbed numbers into my phone. As if a compulsion, I dialed my mother's old work line, 860-636-XXXX. I still remembered this number from all of my childhood afternoons. If I was home from school, bored and missing her, I'd call her at work under the guise of wanting to know what time she'd leave the office or what was for dinner. Never mind that she came home at 6 p.m. most nights, and that dinner was whatever we had in the refrigerator, stir-fried a little with rice or a potato she diced and steamed in the microwave and covered with shredded cheese, salt, black pepper, and paprika. Each time I called, she answered, "DBA Florence." DBA was her title. She was a database administrator. I loved hearing her say her own name, the delicateness of the syllables, and how elegant it seemed coming from her mouth. Florence, Florence, Florence. Maybe when she lived in Hong Kong and attended one of those British schools, her instructors called her that. Or when immigrating to the States, she thought it'd be easier to take on an English name. My theory is that she chose Florence because she had admired Florence Nightingale. There might have been something about Nightingale being a famous nurse, a caretaker, who was also known for her contributions to mathematics and medicine that appealed to my mother. Groundbreaking and could not be swayed by what women did or didn't do in that era. Nobody in my family called my mother Florence, though. She was Moi Moi to her siblings, Mommy to Steph, Caroline, and me, and Amo to our father. It took me until adulthood to ask after her first name in Cantonese or to learn the Chinese characters. You boy, if anyone can speak Cantonese. I already had the vocabulary to describe her, so why did I need more? Why would I bother looking outside myself for the words that she might have identified most as her own? I had Daddy teach me, years after your death, to pronounce your name. Bo Moi, your husband said. Bo Moi, I said. We repeated this for a couple of minutes, and the whole time I was sure I was saying it wrong. After all, I couldn't get my own name right. Ngagyu, Gale, I'd say at parties when I was a kid, prompted by Kofu because he was tickled by my pronunciation. You're called Curry? Kofu teased, laughing into my face and pinching my elbow while I spat out my name over and over, flustered, trying to will a sense into place. After my mother died, I tried to convince my father to speak to me only in Cantonese. But he often had to supply both sides of our dialogues, the expansiveness of these conversations unnatural and overwhelming. Soon, my vocabulary exhausted itself, his patience also depleted, and we slipped back into the hard sounds of English. In my apartment in Seattle, I listened to the thrum of the phone's rings. It forwarded me to an answering machine of some employee, perhaps the one who had replaced my mother years ago. I hung up. I wondered if this person had heard of my mother, or if anyone on her team still thought about her. I was afraid of what thinking too much of her might bring. I guzzled another glass of wine before falling back into bed, the air mattress buckling under me and compressing my sides in a makeshift swaddle. I pictured calling you again. You'd pick up this time. DBA Chow Bo Moi, you'd say, forgoing your last name for our families. Hi, Mommy, I'd say, relieved and ecstatic that you had been here all this time. Had you aged in the afterlife? Would your hair still in this imagined world be wavy? Had it grayed like Daddy's? Way, you'd say. The rest of our conversation played out in Cantonese. In this alternate universe, I was fluent, and we discussed everything I'd eaten that day. Popcorn chicken at the bubble tea spot I always studied at with my friend Colin, half a sandwich, 3 cups of coffee. I'd ask the same to you, and over the phone, you'd demur. Oh, just this and that, you'd say. I wasn't sure if this meant that dead ghost you didn't eat had no need for calories, or if nobody had recently left out offerings. Here, I could not conjure more of the conversation. Too much guilt, too much worry. I pushed these thoughts aside and fell asleep. Thank you.
Love it. I love how when in this alternate reality where you're given the gift of fluency, the first thing you talk about is everything you've eaten.
I know, it's just such a standard, especially in Asian families. I mean,
totally. It's not like we finally could talk about politics and like.
I know. No, I just need a grocery list of everything I bought at the local Chinese grocery store.
That's amazing. And even your name, if you change the tone, how it means curry. My name, Chinese name is Summer, and if you change the tone, it means shrimp. So my mom actually calls me Big Shrimp a lot of the time.
That's actually a really cute nickname, though.
Yeah, it is cute. It's very cute. I remember that passage. I think it was in the mid 200s, page 200 something.
Wow, you have a really good memory for that. I always have trouble finding it because it's so short and in the middle of the book.
Yeah, but I just remember thinking it was so interesting that it takes us 200 pages to discover her birth name, right? And the kind of what that says and like how slowly things are revealed and how long it takes to crawl back into her past or to even acknowledge meeting this person that your mom was before she was your mom. Like, right.
Yeah, it was totally, I mean, something that I really wanted to make intentional because as you age, I feel like, and if you've lost someone at a young age, they still continue to grow in memory. And I really wanted to capture that, especially just the idea of the things that you start to understand in a different light about your parents or anybody as you get older. So, I mean, at the start of the book, I kind of have some of her family history, but it's really just her origin story of when she's younger or when she kind of met my dad, but nothing that sort of defined her as her own person with her own desires until that passage.
Totally. Yeah, it's very sweet because from a daughter's perspective, you know that she has a shirt that has Garfield on it eating lasagna. You know the strawberry shampoo she buys at Walmart. You're very in touch with these very particular details of her everyday life that other people may not know. But in terms of putting her into a context that comes with interrogation and much later as you grow into adulthood. You mentioned your parents' meeting. I know they met at a tag sale.
Yes.
Something that I love is that in the book, you don't say they met at a tag sale, but my dad doesn't know any of the other details. You say they met at a tag sale, and then you give us the entire dialogue of you asking your dad, do you remember what season it was? And he said, I don't know. You're like, what was the temperature? I don't know. Was it love at first sight? I don't know. And just instead of just saying he didn't know anything, you really break it down. And it's in the beginning of the book. So I just thought of like your dad being in this like little protective vessel or something, and you are knocking on the door and he won't answer. So you go to the window, but you're looking all the time for entry points into these stories, looking for anything that he'll give you. And I'm
Yeah.
wondering, because you asked him so many questions in the making of this book, um, do you have any advice on how we go about interviewing loved ones? Because I think it takes a very uh, certain type of patience and persistence, um, to be able to just keep showing up and then being receptive whenever they may be ready.
Yeah, that is such a good question and such a good read of it. I mean, I knew that it would be hard to write this book because I was trying to write about someone who is no longer around and who, for many years, talking about my mother was so painful. It was like she was a bad word, where it was so much easier to just not speak about her. Even the good memories felt really like, oh, this was like, this was a lot. And so to start writing this book, I actually saved interviewing my dad for probably later in the process. But the advice that I would have would be, I come from this journalism background, and I think that my tendency is to first always do a ton of reading and research to procrastinate interviews, because interviews
Yeah.
interviews are probably the scariest thing for me because they're so vulnerable, like what you were saying. Even like right now, the act of like what we're doing also feels really vulnerable too. And every time I talk about this book, it feels like I'm giving a part of myself up. And I think that when I was, earlier, when I was doing stories or profiles for magazines or for radio or something, I didn't, I obviously had a lot of empathy, and or at least I hope I did. And I understood how, difficult it was for a lot of people talking about sensitive things. But for my family, when I was asking them questions about this book, where I kind of knew the boundaries, or I knew the points that might be difficult for them to talk about just because I know them so well, I realized really how tender you have to be. And I guess one of the things that I found myself doing a lot was asking similar questions, or asking the same question but in many different ways, and just letting and going quiet and waiting for a response. I think naturally I'm sort of a more like I think like my stance in a lot of situations is to kind of be the observer. And so in a lot of ways it was doing that and watching body language, or watching or trying to understand what was left unsaid, and letting that silence kind of speak.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
That tone comes across in your book too, or even the way you enter your dad's house. You don't say, "Oh, my dad has a hoarding problem
Yeah.
and I'm mad about it." You say, "The rhododendron bush is overgrown and the cherry tree is chopped at a weird angle and the paint is chipping and the soap is diluted." But it does feel tender because you're giving us these details into, how he lives.
Yeah.
But it's very beautiful. It's very tender.
Oh, thank you. It's
I
such a big responsibility to describe anybody. Do you know what I mean?
Okay, that was gonna be my next question. And because memoir is such a daunting genre, because you're archiving your family and their history, and it's such a big responsibility because the way you portray your family is the only way many of us will ever know them.
Yeah.
And your loved ones are being documented into permanence through your lens alone. And that's really intense. And I imagine, as I did, I felt very protective of my loved ones. I didn't want them to be judged or critiqued by strangers, right? So you want to put them in a good light, but at the same time, you want to honor their complexity and the fact that we're all flawed, because that's also giving them their humanity. So my question is, how was it converting the people in your life into characters, and how did you go about choosing detail, and what felt most important for you to get right?
Oh, that's such a good question. I think that was one of the hardest things about this book, besides the actual, sort of pieces that felt as though they had to happen, like, the beats of the narrative itself. Because, yeah, I'm so protective of my family. I'm really close to my sisters. Actually, reading your book, the dynamic that you have with Tiffany, it just kind of reminded me of my two older sisters, Caroline and Steph. And I knew that this had to be something that felt like, or something that genuinely was a thing that we kind of created together, while acknowledging that this is my version of the story. And the way I drafted was, I think the first draft or the earlier drafts were always a little bit, um, more raw. And then I would go back and give myself a couple months to really sit with whatever descriptions I'd had and really try and balance out and be able to step back and say, okay, how is my dad being perceived right here? Or am I protecting him while also still being honest and true to, our relationship and the narrative? And I mean, there's some really complicated people in my family. I mean, we're all complicated people. Everybody is in the world. But I really felt that need to kind of really balance it and look out for all of them.
Yeah. Well, you did a phenomenal job because you seek to understand each person.
Yeah.
You don't just drop them under a label and then carry on.
Yeah, I never wanted to apply labels to anybody.
Right.
I always tried to really paint the smaller details, like what you were saying about the Garfield, or the face that my family makes together, the teeth face. Oh, yeah, I love that you did it. I hope everyone at home is doing that too. It's just become such a fun way for like my mom and people to live on and have that grow with the passage of that. So thank you for doing that.
I loved it. I thought it was so funny.
Yeah, it's just, I think it's the little details that can really help make someone fuller. And that's what I always try and do in like profiling too, in profiles.
Yeah. Oh yeah. I know there's an interview I did, and then they said she was wearing pearl earrings. I was like, I have to be really careful about what what I'm wearing.
I need to be more careful about everything.
Yeah. Like, geez. Yeah. So I thought a lot about how you were 13 when your mom passed away. Your sisters are already kind of moving out of the house, and it's just you and your dad. And he would say things like, it's been a year since she died, which is like very, very little time in grief timelines.
Yeah.
And, him saying you're making this harder on yourself by being sad. And I imagine it was very difficult to mourn if the only other voice in the household is pressuring you to move on or tuck it away. So I was curious about who or what encouraged you to begin investigating the grief, and like how you even got to the point of being willing to write a memoir, which is a real way to sit down with it for long periods of time. But what people or texts kind of started nudging you away from that raw pain and kind of aversion to it, to a place where you're like, well, it's possible to sit down and like marinate in it for 300 pages.
Yeah. I think I mean, my dad never really wanted to talk about grief or the loss of, his wife, because it was so painful. And I think that had always been his way of coping, which was to not talk about it. And so the way that I wound up really learning to express myself was through writing and through, I think, looking for mothers and other people. At a young age, I was really good at identifying that in my sisters or teachers at school. But I had one teacher, an English teacher, named Blake Floyd at Glastonbury High School. I don't know if she's on here, but I remember she gave me a journal, and then also she gave me a copy of Annie Dillard's The Writing Life, which for a 13-year-old is great. And I actually still have that copy somewhere over there in my bookshelf, and I still refer to it frequently. But I remember just reading Annie Dillard's descriptions and wanting and realizing that I loved writing so much, and that maybe I could start taking it very seriously. And I think I had always turned to writing as, not even just journaling, but trying to turn this story of my mom's death into something sort of outside myself, because it was easier than addressing it directly in a journal or like a live journal or whatever we were doing when we were in high school, online blogging. But I think figuring out how to tell it in a story gave it some distance that really protected me. And I think honestly, that's kind of why I was always drawn to journalism and telling stories more generally. And so I found myself doing, like writing kind of a novel that I didn't really realize was very autobiographical in college. And then finally, when I had been sort of working in radio for a few years and really missed writing, I found myself really kind of turning back to the more creative side of nonfiction writing, and I really enjoyed it. And it felt, I know the writer T.K. Madden, who I know you know, she has this beautiful essay called Against Catharsis, which when I was working on this book, I saw that essay published in like LitHub or somewhere. And she basically makes the argument that, you know, for her writing her memoir, Long Live the Tribe of Fatherless Girls, it wasn't this, like therapeutic thing. It was, a work of narrative writing, and it was hard work, and there was so much crafting in it. And I really felt that, and that was really helpful. And I kind of think that, as I got older, it really became this for me, just a work that I really wanted to do.
Yeah, absolutely. And yes, Kira is flipping amazing. I noticed that you journaled quite a bit, or you had all these like references to journal entries. I was like, damn, she was like ready to do this.
I was. I've been waiting for years.
You had mentioned looking for mothers, and I understand that like in a nourishment point of way, but in terms of like character figures, what really stood out to me is how unique your mother was, and also how we aren't given many portraits of especially Chinese mothers who are more goofy. And that's something
Yeah.
that I really appreciated about your descriptions of her, or the way mischievous, is it mischievous or mischievous?
I think it's either or either or.
Mischievous, she was theatrical, like she would pull pranks. And I think I have to imagine that's another engine in you to want to preserve her, because
Yes.
we don't see that model of Asian mom. And that's how I always felt about my mom too. I was like, my mom is so wild and silly. And I love that your mom, she wanted like a cinnamon colored Cadillac, something like flashy. And the way she described a van having its headlights were narrow, so
yes. Yeah.
vicious. Like that's so funny. And a memory of you, going to horseback riding and coming home and stopping at Burger King and like stuffing fries into your mouth and getting home and hiding the evidence so your family wouldn't be mad that you didn't buy fries for them. Like all of these things were so wonderful and particular. Can you talk a little bit about the goofiness and documenting?
Oh my gosh. Yeah. My mom had such a she was just so vivacious, and her sense of humor was legendary, and so was her temper. But I knew, I knew it's so funny because in my family, everyone's always like, "Oh, the Yu family temper," which it's sort of like, but she was also so deeply, a goofball. And one thing I wanted when I wrote this book was to not be too serious. I mean, it's a memoir about loss, and I think when, of course, it's going to have things that are, sad, but I don't think of it as a deeply sad book. But that's probably because I wrote it and it's my life. But I didn't want my mom to be preserved in this book or in general in history as only her death. Because I knew that, some people are just so much more than the circumstances that take them from this world or, foist them into whatever spotlight. And I thought that texture was really important, where And I wanted to really use it as this thematic device where, this book is so much about taxidermy and ghosts.
Yeah.
And my mom had the most macabre sense of humor where she knew I was afraid of dead things and once joked to me when I was little that she wanted me to get her body stuffed and taxidermied in my future apartment. And I'm pretty sure I was like 9 or something. And I was nowhere near getting an apartment. So that's just an objectively, like strange thing to joke about with your kid. But I tried to even use it as a device where her as a ghost becomes this theme and this narrative tie throughout the book where I want to appease her spirit. I want to sort of please her and do all these things for her. But yeah, she had such a great sense of humor. And you're right. I do think that it goes against a lot of what we see in books or TV about the typical Asian mother. And I don't know, my mom was just great.
Yeah, totally. And I love, you know, talking about burying her in the LL Bean dress because it was the most comfortable, and her coming back to reprimand you that it's so cheap. Like it's just
You're like, oh shit, sorry, mom. Now I know. But
and also this bluntness she had. I identified with that too, or recognized it in my own family. Like when she said, what is it? After high school, I'm gonna divorce your dad.
yeah.
You're young and you're like, whoa. My mom would always say these really big, blunt things now. And I was like, dang, I'll have to go process this.
I know.
I love it. It still has this like playful tone. It's not some like, I don't even know how to describe it. I really appreciated that.
Thank you for saying all that. I mean, I think that my mom is where I got my sense of humor from, which is very dry and deadpan. And I think growing up as a kid, who's 10 or so, it was very confusing to, for other children because they'd be like, are you joking or are you serious? I don't know. And now that I'm an adult, it's a little bit better, but.
Well, I think you even open the book with the scene, the first time my mom saw a dead body, and she was walking to school when she was young. And I think just like the richness of her past and history and what she had to bear witness to, and then translating that into her nice daily life, taking care of kids in Connecticut,
Yeah.
glimpses of like just realness. It's really amazing.
Thank you.
So can I read a quote from your book really quickly?
Sure.
Okay. So you said, all children live in their parents' realities or the realities of those who raise them. But to be the children of immigrants is, in a sense, varying degrees of living in our parents' remaking of the country in which they were born. I thought that was incredible. Like, and you make that observation when you go to Guangzhou with your dad, where he was born.
Mm-hmm.
I think for every child of an immigrant, the moment you go visit their home country, there's like lights going off in your head because suddenly there are habits or behaviors or mannerisms that your parents have that suddenly have a context, or you realize they're not the only ones with these certain characteristics. Can you talk about what it was like revisiting that space?
Yeah. I went to China with my family when I was a freshman in college and thought that, I don't know. I mean, I think I just had assumed that my dad missed China so much and that it hadn't really changed much in 20 or so years. But going there, I realized, and of course, in college, I took so many Asian American studies classes. I was so interested in the question of like, what does Asian American even mean? And I'd have these big sort of existential crises where it's like, it's so impossible to define the way that we can define Asian American. It's just to like not know. Nobody knows really what it means. So I was really in my feels about that when we went to Guangzhou. And I remember just observing my dad who, everything was just so unrecognizable and he was getting increasingly sort of like withdrawn in this way that I noticed and sort of like ached for him for it, because there was still this like longing and nostalgia. And that was when I really understood that, wow, he'd been in America for decades, and America was truly his home, and everything that he'd assembled and his habits, even, you know, his habits of hoarding or wanting just to keep everything, were in a way products of, maybe not cultural, but products of his own childhood. And just the different ways that he would go to the grocery store and what he would shop for and the foods he would cook. I understood then that it was just this attempt, which I think is so common for immigrants, especially immigrants who live in very non, you know, areas that don't have a lot of people who look like them. And it just, the big sort of difference between China and then also Seattle, where I went to school, and then thinking about Connecticut, his own sort of space. I really understood all of the worlds he has existed in, and how, you know, even if you're in one place, you are still always kind of longing for something else.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's beautiful. I have a final question before I hand it over to the audience,
Oh,
but there's a line in your book where you say, I haven't, you're addressing your mom. The you is your mom.
mhm.
I haven't wanted to kill you, so I haven't written about your passing. I
Wow.
thought that was so profound and really speaks to the way we process things and how our mind will hold things off until we're
Yeah.
ready. And even now, like, I feel like collectively we're all in this state of not really accepting all the changes that have happened. Like, we're in this weird state of transition. And I think about how in the book, you know, a tombstone was made for your mom, but it like came out not like you wanted it. And then there's the payment couldn't be made. So the tombstone was confiscated and there's no tombstone for many, many years.
Yeah.
And then your brother's ashes, you know, your mom wanted to be buried with them, but they kind of just sat in the living room accumulating dust. But when I was reading, I just kept thinking about how it's not about not being able to make the payment for the tombstone, and it's not about being lazy and not burying the ashes. It's like you will come to these things when you're ready. And there's
Right.
also this odd sort of comfort in not putting things fully to rest because
Right.
you're in this inconclusive state, and it's almost scarier to complete these tasks. It's scarier to write the sentence because once you give it an ending or once you complete the tasks your mother asked you to do, like what else is there for you to do? And so
Yes.
I was wondering, it sounded like it was fairly recent that you were able to bury the ashes and replace the tombstone and then put all these truths into your book. And yesterday the book is like in the world, so all of us also are aware of this
Yeah.
loss.
Yeah.
And so how has it, can you just speak to that, like maybe the slowness of grief and what it's been like to like put things down and like kind of put things to rest, but
Yeah.
also hold on to what you
Yes.
want to hold on to.
That part about, you know, that line that you just read, where I didn't want to write about my mom's death. That was one of the hardest passages to write in the book, because it was just so hard to go back into those memories. And I think, as you have pointed out, all the examples, it's so much easier to turn away and not to face something head on.
Mhm.
And in general, I found finishing this book really hard. Like the act of just emailing it to my editor. I don't know if you felt that way for Know My Name, but there are always so many things you can fiddle with. And it's not even because I'm a super perfectionist, but because it felt like such a gift to be able to sit for so long in this space and have an excuse to email my aunt or text my aunt or call her or my dad and ask them questions like this, and to sort of be able to see the world through this lens that I had created. I feel like the entire book is kind of this argument of um, how loss can be a big part of your identity, and this protracted grief can really shape you. It's like the concept of melancholia, which I write about. Freud makes the distinction between mourning and melancholia, where mourning melancholia kind of has like a protracted sense, And I really thought that was so important to show. And I mean, that's kind of why I don't think this book is exactly a grief memoir. I think it's more about just how loss can kind of become a big part of someone. And that was so important for me to show. Yeah, I don't know if that answered your question, but
Well, absolutely.
yeah,
It is a part of your identity, and it's
yeah,
odd to let that go. You're like, well, then who am
right.
I? Then
Yeah,
what fills that part? Um,
yeah.
yeah. So I'm going to turn it over to the audience. This is a brutal question for writers from Jill, which is there anything you took out of the book you wish you kept in? So funny.
Not at this point because
Yeah.
it's only been out for a day.
Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, we'll see. Maybe ask me again in a year.
I talked to Tikira about this, about the pressure we felt to include everything,
Yeah,
that being sort of the scarcity mindset because we're worried that we won't be given opportunities to write in the future.
right.
Whereas in reality, like we will have abundant opportunities
Yeah,
and places to say more. Um,
right. I
so
agree. Yeah. I mean, the first drafts that I have had of this book were so long and
yeah,
unwieldy, and there's just so much stuff that it was left on the cutting room floor that I'm really glad is not in the book. So I feel like for me right now, this is the most pared down, and it's still a big book. I mean, it's like 360 something pages. So
mm-hmm. Yeah.
but yeah, I do think, I mean, I was talking about this with Ocean Vuong when I profiled him a few years ago, just about this idea when he was finished with his poetry collection, Night Sky with Exit Wounds. Um, so much of that book was about sort of war and masculinity and queerness. And people were asking him what he wanted to write about next. And he said, like, war, masculinity, and queerness in his own words. And they were kind of like, well, don't you think you're done with that? And his mindset was just, you're never finished. And
Yeah.
there should be no set limit. And I think that hearing that was so helpful.
Totally. Yep. I love this question in the chat. Uh, where did it go? It was about did this writing this book make your family closer? Because I think
Oh,
when you go into writing, that's not something you're like, oh, I hope this bonds us all. You're like, if anything, you're like, it's, oh no, I'm writing a bomb. But it can make, at least for me.
yeah, it did. I mean, I called my sister so much about this, and I called my dad a lot about this. And I actually think that the act of interviewing him gave us so many reasons to speak and to kind of speak across this distance that had grown between us. And it was just a way, like when do you have the opportunity to ask your family just very candid things about their lives and their histories? And so I think it really did make us a lot closer.
Yeah, totally.
Yeah.
Laura asked, kind of as a follow-up to what we were just talking about, once it was finished, did you have that sense of death you feared, or was it more relief, love, etc.? Like, how does it feel? I mean, I get, again, you're day one, but how is it feeling?
Um, in general, like, was the question about, do you think how I feel toward?
Or I guess when you handed in the manuscript and did let it go and just set in motion
Oh,
going into the world.
yeah, I think I feel really good about it now, where I don't know if this sounds cheesy, but I kind of think of it as not my book anymore. I mean, it's my book because I wrote it, but now people are allowed to sort of engage with it and they can take it as their own and they can build their own meanings on top of it. And I also think that's just a helpful way for me to just kind of establish boundaries between, like letting this book exist on its own. And
Yeah.
so I'm really excited to see, I've already been getting some really nice messages from people, and it's been really meaningful to just kind of see it take on new meaning in ways that I couldn't even have imagined.
Yeah, absolutely. Melanie asks a fun one about the production and design of the novel. Oh, the cover. Yeah, the cover. I
Mm.
love hearing about cover selection. So how did
Oh,
you land on this one? And how many variations were there?
oh my gosh, there are a lot of variations. The designer who designed the cover actually did Tikira's cover.
Oh, wow.
Um, and I knew from the jump that I wanted there to be a taxidermied fish, or a fish in general, because fish is just it's a symbolic tie throughout the book, especially taxidermy, as I mentioned. My dad tried to taxidermy a fish once, and
Elmer's
it's
glue.
Elmer's glue, YouTube tutorials, all that fun stuff. It's still there. And I just kind of thought that it might be a little bit cheeky. And so there were like a gazillion variations on different fish, like little like goldfish, or a cute fish.
Mm.
And I wanted something with some bite, and that was like a little bit cheeky and funny. And this was it. So yeah, there are many different variations on fish, and there were a lot of other different things that they would go for. Like there's a scene toward the end of the book with umbrellas in a cemetery, and for a while there were some options with that, but I was really fortunate because I got a lot of input, and my editor helped fight for this a lot.
Yeah, I love it. It's very striking. I love how it came out.
Thank you.
So our final question will be from Kristen. She's asking about your personal writing practices and producing writing with the patience and softness needed for processing grief. And I also sounded like you were finishing writing during the pandemic, which is unbelievable. I really would love to hear about how you were writing and simultaneously processing and self.
Yeah, I mean, it was hard, and I think that just being gentle with myself, and a lot of people talk about routines that they keep for writing. I don't really have one. I tend to write at night, in the really late hours when I feel looser and sort of like more in my own body. I think that especially this past year, I felt it was so necessary to feel grounded. And I would take a lot of walks. And one of my best friends, Maria Krimji, and I would she lives in Karachi now. And so we've always had a friendship that has been long distance, but we would check in every morning my time or nighttime her time, and just text about like what our writing practices were, what we're doing today, and just being very intentional about how I was going to spend my day, and what I was going to work on, and not overloading myself, and going at my own pace. Honestly, I think that was most helpful. What about you?
I just zoomed a lot, but I think it's really hard to, this past year required being surface level so much, like paying attention to everything that was happening.
Yeah.
And for me, that made it really hard to submerge to that place where I go in writing. But just like you, I don't have a routine, because I think when you're also processing, some days you're really going to feel off or just more consumed by emotion, and that you cannot convert into something.
But that's the work too, though,
Yeah, that is the work too. But yeah, nighttime, I feel like I'm not observed and no one is pinging me. So
right.
I think it is, I can rely on nighttime to be a sacred space where nothing is happening.
Yeah.
And that's when I get things done.
Yeah. Nighttime is really a vulnerable, it just lets you kind of play, or at least me. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I hope you do a lot of playing tonight, because you have a lot to celebrate. I think your book was it was infused with such a warmth, even during the sad parts. And I just think it's brilliant. So everybody, please buy Seeing Ghosts from your local book.
Oh, thank you. And I will say, one thing I wanted to say was I actually remember when I listened to your book, I listened first as an audiobook. And it was last year, right before, a couple months before the lockdown. And there was just so much warmth hearing you, especially since you narrated your own memoir. And I thought about that frequently, actually, in the writing process, and just the tenderness through which you discussed everything that happened in your family also. So thank you for that.
Yeah, because no matter the sadness of the story that's inevitable just by fact, it's still you're the one who's telling it, right?
Yeah.
And so your voice is warm and it's tender. And the way we meet all your loved ones is through you, and you love them.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
it's very successful. Actually, I do want to ask quickly, have you read your audiobook?
I did read it. Oh my gosh. And recording it, I thought that since I worked in radio, I'd be like, oh, it'll be fine. I don't know. Did you have this also where you couldn't drink coffee or have dairy before you recorded?
Well, duh, because your bowels would.
Yeah, I know. So the whole time, I mean, obviously it was hard to read the book too because it's just so emotional. But like the whole time I was fixated on my stomach not grumbling, and
Uh,
they would have to stop every 15 seconds until finally by the end. So if you guys listen to my audiobook, just please keep this image in your mind where they had to tie a pillow around my torso. And I decided to stand the entire like 15, the entire week of recording. So I was just standing there with a pillow tied with a sweater or a scarf around my belly to help dampen the sound of my stomach.
That's
I learned a
so
lot
funny.
about myself and my body just in this. Learned a lot about pronunciation.
Oh
Cannot
my
pronounce the
god.
letter H.
The letter H, that was your
Yeah,
thing?
I used to say H with a K. I don't know. Well, what was it like for you recording it?
I realized I say like button instead of button, or like
Yeah.
kitten instead of kitten. Um, and then I'm gonna try and explain this quickly, but woman, okay,
Yes.
woman means we in
Yes.
Chinese, right? But it's WOMEN
Yeah.
means we.
Yeah.
But then woman, plural on the page in English, is pronounced women.
Yes.
And so I would always say woman, like woman.
Yeah.
And I had to be like women. We had to pause so many times because I couldn't say women.
So I don't make like I cannot say women versus woman, like
Yes.
what singular woman versus plural woman, the English
Yes.
word, not even the Chinese one. So when I was doing radio in my NPR scripts, I would have to type out women as WIMMYN.
I did that too. WHIM, all caps. Women.
Yeah.
But then I also turned off all of the lights. So I read completely in the dark so that I could
Wow.
focus. I actually think it's so fascinating for each author. I'd rather have a picture of the author reading their audiobook because I think that's really fascinating. A picture to accompany the audio, because it's so funny how much you have to like gear into being able to just read it.
Yeah, totally. I love the reading in the dark though. If only all readings could be like that.
Yeah, I know. Totally. Well, it was such a joy to speak with you. I could speak with you on and on forever.
Same.
And I hope everyone enjoys this book as much as I did.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming.